Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion here at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. We welcome you to today's CLGS Lavender Lunch, Trans Day of Remembrance Toolkit for Congregations and Faith Communities. And this workshop will be coordinated by the Reverend Jakob Hero Shaw, who coordinates our CLGS Transgender Roundtable, serves also as faculty for the Trans Religious Leaders Cohort program. And Jakob is also pastor of MCC Tampa. Again, my name is Bernie. I use he, they pronouns. I have just a few housekeeping details before we begin. First of all, this event is being recorded for later posting on our socials. We will not record, nor will we post the chat feature. And we will be live streaming this as well. So with no further information from me, I'd like to welcome Jakob to the room. And again, thank you for being here for this CLGS Lavender Lunch. Jakob.
Hi, everyone. I am glad to be here with you today, and we're gonna jump right in, although this is an interactive webinar, so I'm gonna encourage folks to chime in throughout. I'm just gonna share my screen here. All right. So the purpose of today's webinar is to give folks a toolkit for doing Trans Day of Remembrance in a congregational setting. Although most of my work has been in Christian and some in Jewish spaces, so you might notice a bit of a skew towards that, but this is for any kind of folks doing any sort of faith work, religious work in communities. So I invite you to just start off, put your name and pronouns in the chat, and also what brings you to this workshop. Are you serving a community? Are you just interested in the topic? Just let us know by introducing yourself in the chat. And we're going to dive right into talking about the what, why, and when of Trans Day of Remembrance. Here we are at the beginning of October. The reason why we're doing this now is to give folks plenty of time to use these tools and prepare, because Trans Day of Remembrance happens on November 20th, or whatever. If you're in a community that meets on a particular day of the week, whatever of that day of the week is closest to November 20th. So personally, in my community at the Metropolitan Community Church of Tampa, in Tampa, Florida, we are going to be having we do our Trans Day of Remembrance service in our Sunday morning weekly worship service. We've done it that way every year for quite a long time, so that the whole community comes together for it. So yeah, we're doing the Sunday before. Let's see. I'm just checking out the chat and seeing who else here. Welcome. I'm glad you all are with us. And it doesn't really have to happen on November 20th, but it happens always sometime around then. So the history of, I'll read you this quote in a second. The history of TDORR is that it was started by Gwendolyn Ann Smith. It's actually been happening, this is the 25th year. It's been happening since 1999. She started it as a vigil in memory of her friend Rita Hester, who was murdered, was a trans woman. So in this quote, she says, Transgender Day of Remembrance seeks to highlight the losses we face due to anti-transgender bigotry and violence. I am no stranger to the need to fight for our rights, and the right to simply exist is first and foremost. With so many seeking to erase transgender people, sometimes in the most brutal ways possible, it is vitally important that those we lose are remembered and that we continue to fight for justice. And again, that was the TDORR founder, Gwendolyn Ann Smith, who said these words. So as we get started, I want to lift up that there are a variety of ways to honor trans people in our communities, and that there's a difference between the Trans Day of Remembrance and the Trans Day of Visibility. Trans Day of Visibility is March 31st, and it's a celebration of all trans people. Trans Day of Remembrance is what we're talking about today, and I find as a pastor, by the way, folks, y'all are welcome to turn your cameras on if you want to, no pressure. That as a pastor, I find that sometimes there are people who get confused between the two. And even in a worship service where I've spoken about Trans Day of Remembrance, I lift up, and this is an important piece of it, that disproportionately the people who are murdered in acts of anti-trans violence are trans women of color. And I am quite obviously not a trans woman of color, but even in those services where I'm talking about that reality, I find that sometimes people think that it's a celebration of people like me. They just make an assumption. And I say again and again and again, that is not what it's about. We have other times that we honor and celebrate trans people. Trans Day of Remembrance is around recognizing those whose lives have been lost. Another piece that I want to hold in this really complicated space is that just the reality that every single year we have a day that's set aside that we are going to honor the people who are killed throughout the year by anti-trans hate. And I want us to hold with a real heaviness in our hearts, the reality of how that lands on the people who are present with us. If we're leading, whether it's an event or a worship service or a rally or some other kind of public event, we often have, like one of the things here locally that we often have is a vigil in the park on November 20th. And I want us, those of us who are leaders and who are going to be speaking at these kinds of events or organizing these events, to always have it present in our minds that there will be people who are attending or people who are seeing it on the news or watching it if you're live streaming, who are thinking that this could be them, that it could be their name being read the following year. And that is awful and traumatic. And I think that there's a re-traumatizing that can happen every year with Trans Day of Remembrance. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. We should do it, but we have to hold this sacred responsibility. And that's why I also really want to lift up the difference between Trans Day of Visibility and Trans Day of Remembrance, because, and I'll share this in the next slide. There are a variety of ways to expand Trans Day of Remembrance so that it's not only about trans people being murdered. And I think it is incredibly important that we not lose the actual meaning of why we're doing it. So you can have Trans Awareness Week. A lot of organizations do this. This is, I think, probably at the stage now that it's pretty much just a recognized thing. It's typically the week leading up to November 20th, however that falls in the calendar. Whether it's Monday to Friday before, or Saturday to Sunday, or Sunday to Saturday, or whatever. But Trans Awareness Week, where you can have programming and guest speakers and things like that. The other thing, and in the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a shift to it being Transgender Day of Remembrance and Resilience, which helps frame it in having some hope. And to be honest, I have found that adding in the resilience can make it more palatable. Not that we have to take things that are awful and try to make them easier to understand or easier to swallow or make it more pleasant. But the reality is that if we want people to show up to events, sometimes they do have to at least have some hope involved. And again, as we go back to this thing of holding the sacred responsibility of knowing that there are people who attend this or see this or witness it who are thinking this could be them. So by putting in resilience, I think that's important. For the ease of this workshop, I'm just going to call it TDORR, which stands for Trans Day of Remembrance, or Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience. But I encourage you to give that some thought if you are currently planning a TDORR event, to what it would mean to you and your community to have a focus on both the remembrance and the resilience, but not skipping the remembrance. Like, I don't want us to lose that very important piece. So the other thing is, I would like for us to celebrate the lives of trans folks all year long, and not only speak about trans people when they're getting killed. I think lots of progressive religious communities are great at lifting up TDORR. It becomes an important event that they participate in their communities, in their congregations, and in some communities, that's the only time you might hear the word trans talked about. So there are other ways throughout the year to lift up trans people in our congregations, whether it be choosing guest speakers throughout the year, having a discussion series, reading books by trans authors, and having a book group. There's multitude of ways, but I just wanted to lift up the importance of not letting ourselves only think about trans people on Trans Day of Remembrance. And I'll say myself, as a trans person who is a pastor, I'm pastoring a congregation where we have a few, but not very many trans people. I find that sometimes even I don't talk about trans issues. I can go easily months without bringing up, maybe I might say LGBT, so it's implied, right? Because I've said it all, LGBTQ plus, but without having a special focus on trans people. It's very easy for me to do that. And I'm a trans person. So if I know that if I struggle to figure out ways to bring the reality of trans lives into sermon topics and discussion groups and book series and things like that, then others might as well. Now, I will also say that as anybody who's leading a congregation of folks who maybe don't identify the same way that they do, whether that be a cisgender person who's gay and is pastoring a church where most people are straight, or a trans person like myself pastoring a church where most people are not trans, sometimes there's also a little bit of a feeling of pressure to not talk about the thing that makes the leader up there in front of everyone different from most of the people who attend. I encourage myself and others to not fall down that particular hole, and to because it is also really important for people's voices to be heard. Now, if you're not a trans person, but you've got some trans folks in your community, it's so important to throughout the whole year find ways to make their lives and identities always just present and welcome in the community. this slide is to highlight some language. On Trans Day of Remembrance, we honor those who lost their lives to anti-transgender violence. I say anti-transgender violence instead of saying on TDORR, we honor those who lost their lives because they're trans. The reason for this is that it's not because they're trans. On the one hand, not all people who are honored on TDORR identify as trans. Some people are killed for being perceived as identifying as trans. And language is so important. So when we say someone was killed for being trans, that puts the death on that person, the responsibility for that, and that's not where we want it, right? The responsibility is on the hate, is on the person who behaved in this way, who did this, who attacked the person, or not on the trans person or the gender nonconforming person. So I really encourage just having some care around what we say, anti-transgender violence, or anti-trans bigotry or transphobia. These are all ways that we can talk about it that puts the weight of what happened on those who commit the acts, not those who are finding themselves being attacked. They didn't lose their lives because they were trans, but rather because of transphobia. And Pastor Kamal, I see your question in the chat. I'll get to that in just a sec. All right. I'm going to open this up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute so we can kind of see each other. If you're comfortable doing so, you can turn your camera on if you haven't already. And we're going to talk for just a few minutes about what TDORR means to you and to your congregation. And before we get to that, I'm going to jump into some of the comments. So, Pastor Kamal, I'm going to go ahead and read what you wrote for those who can't see the chat, if that's all right with you. Okay. I don't know that there are trans folks at the church I serve. I may be the only person who has heard of this. I spoke about it last year and plan to do so again. Do you have suggestions? Yes, absolutely. So let me tell you, if you're not sure that there are trans folks, one, as you acknowledge in your comment, there probably are, or there possibly are. But also, as you start to make this a thing that you talk about in your congregation, word will get out in the community that you're a safe person to come to. So whether they come to a church service or they come to meet with you privately, I think it's great as a person who wants to lift up TDORR and wants to be, I assume, supportive to the trans community, that you're getting the word out about that. I think one thing I really think is helpful is putting it in an actual worship service as opposed to having a separate event, because what I found around TDORR and around Trans Day of Visibility and other things that don't even have to do with trans people, like World AIDS Day, issues that people really care about, they truly do care about it, but they might not show up on a different day of the week. That's not the day that you're having a worship service. So early on in my being a pastor, I discovered, if I put these things in the actual worship service, more people are going to learn about it, even those who thought it had nothing to do with them. So putting it in the worship service, and we're going to talk about some ways, like practical tools for how to put it in a worship service in a few minutes. But also, I really encourage you throughout the year, and not just you, Pastor Kamal, but everyone, to really think about what could you add, whether it's like just some liturgies. At the end, I'm gonna put in a link to just a list of a whole bunch of different liturgies and websites and things where you can get some more info. But what kinds of things could you do? Just little things throughout the year. Another thing I find is really helpful, you know, if any of us are the type of preacher that uses sermon examples, like we kind of make up some stories. The made up characters that we sometimes talk about, you can make them whatever, right? You can make them gay and lesbian, you can make them trans, and it doesn't have to be central to the story, but it could just be little details. When I was first, many years ago, decades ago, when I was first coming out and starting to transition, my pastor at the time wanted to help our congregation be more trans inclusive without drawing attention to me. I was in my early 20s. I was the only trans person in the congregation. And so what she did was she just talked about trans stuff a lot. She just worked it into conversation and never tied it to me. Didn't like point me out or even ask me to be the person to speak. She just made it a normal thing that we talk about in church. And to me, that was just the most amazing thing, because I was hearing myself talked about, but without it being about me. I was hearing, trans people being talked about like it was just normal, because in my life at that time, obviously it's normal, but it didn't feel normal because no one had told me it was normal. And it normalized it for me and for other people. So, just having trans folks being just among the things you talk about. And when we talk about, if you're, talking about justice issues, looking into what's happening around the country, what states are doing things that are frightening for trans people, and lifting that up. We had a workshop last week around how to not get yourself into trouble talking about things that are political. And this is one of those areas where you can actually, without worrying about losing your nonprofit status as a faith community, you can talk about legislations and things. If you're not telling people how to vote, but talking about the impact that it has on people in your community. As I said at the beginning, I live in Florida, so I never run out of things that I can talk about with the ways that the trans community is impacted, because Florida is, a challenging place to be a trans person. And so, one of the things that is challenging is Florida's really been arguing a lot around identification. That's a huge justice issue, what we're allowed to call ourselves on our identification. And they still haven't figured out what it is. So there are people, myself included, who technically could be accused of committing fraud, because for the last 25 years, every piece of identification I have has said male on it, but that wasn't my assigned sex ever. So that's a justice issue. And even when I talk about it, I don't use myself as the example. I'm just using that for us in this webinar, but lifting those kinds of issues up, because especially for anybody who is trying to access things like social services, these are major issues that people are dealing with. So that's the social justice piece. Then the other side of it is just the celebratory thing. And throughout the year, where can you celebrate? Last year, or earlier this year, Easter happened to fall on March 31st, which is Trans Day of Visibility. And I have a congregant who is a trans woman, delightful human being who wanted to get baptized on Easter, unrelated to it being Trans Day of Visibility. It was like my most favorite coincidence, and it was so joyful. It meant also that I didn't, make the whole Easter service about Trans Day of Visibility, but I had this liturgical act, this like being able to put into action. Now it helps that this is someone who the whole community knows, the church knows her, they know that she's trans, they know a lot about her story. So it was just incredible. The timing was so beautiful. And I really, even though today we're talking about Trans Day of Remembrance, I do want to lift up that when we're talking about trans folks, to not always have it be doom and gloom and sadness. Yeah, Bernie.
Jacob, I really appreciate you mentioning Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience, and also the Trans Awareness Week. One thing, just briefly, 12, 13 years ago, I was serving on the board of a Unitarian Universalist church back east, where we largely raised our children. And there was a young person, 13, who was beginning to transition, and it was the first experience in our congregation of that. And there, we were surprised, although it shouldn't have been surprising, that once Hal began talking about themselves in that way, and really was a vital member of the community, especially for young people in our congregation, we had other young people in the congregation begin to voice their budding awareness of who they were as people, right? And it was such a positive experience journeying with Hal over those 2 years. But we were also very concerned and worried in that celebrating TDORR, we hadn't thought of resilience at that point. It would be so overwhelming for especially the young people who were beginning to speak about themselves. And I have to say, quite honestly, I find TDOR services some of the most emotional services I've ever attended. And so it's, so I'll stop there. It's just I'm trying to think about, young people especially, to remember and also not lose hope. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I can hear it in your voice that you're so moved by it, and it's true. Like when you say that, I just think about the experience of young people who are just coming out, and maybe the only time their community, like let's say they're in an accepting community where they're going to talk about TDOR, but maybe if that's the only thing that they hear about is like people like you get murdered, like that is so painful. So that is why I think it's so important to have the resilience and also, in faith communities, we have an ability to talk about really heavy things and to do it in a way that's sacred without being too much. Maybe I don't know how to exactly say it. Like we can go to the heavy places, we can go to deep lament, and Scripture has, again, I'm talking more in the Abrahamic and Christian and Jewish specifically traditions, but Scripture has a real way of making that clear that we need to talk about those challenging things. And that's okay. I want to go up to one other comment from Allan. So Allan said that he is studying belonging amongst trans students of color who attend Catholic universities. I'm curious to hear how we can better support students on campus. Wow, awesome. I think sometimes, well, first of all, because I went to Pacific School of Religion and I studied at all of the Catholic seminaries that were part of the GTU back in those days. And I know some really amazing Catholics. I know some very cool priests and nuns and lay people. So I know there's an assumption that Catholic communities are going to be anti-trans, and in my experience, yeah, there are Catholics who are anti-trans, but there are some people who are doing amazing work around radical welcome and inclusion. So, in a practical sense, how to be supportive to students on campus, I think especially in a Catholic context, being welcoming and helping people see that they belong. And, yeah, okay. Even the Pope said some welcoming stuff and also some not welcoming stuff. But when you're talking about building community and helping students feel like they belong, then their lives have value. And that's another thing about TDORR. It is lifting up that trans lives have value in a world that might seem like it's saying that trans lives don't. So when you're working with young people in particular, don't underestimate your ability to make people feel welcomed and included and important, and just okay in who they are. I so connect with that, how important it was to me back when I was a college student to have people who could say to me, like, you're okay, who you are is okay. Is anyone, shifting gears a little bit, is anybody currently working on a particular Trans Day of Remembrance and Resilience event or service? Now is about the time when we're starting to figure out what we're going to be doing, because it's about 6 weeks away. Does anyone have any examples of what you're doing in your community? Well, if you're feeling too shy to say it, you can drop it in the chat too. I'll go back to our to sharing the screen. So here's, and this is something I shared months ago when I did the similar workshop on Trans Day of Visibility. What we need in our communities is representation without tokenization. So what does that mean? It means asking people to participate because of what they can bring to the event, not only because of their identity. And this extends beyond TDORR. So we want to have trans voices lifted up. We want to have especially trans people of color who are centered and their stories are centered when we're talking about trans issues. We want to have people who can speak about the weight of honoring the loss of trans lives. And we need to be careful to not be tokenizing, not make people think that all that they bring to the conversation, to the event, is the fact that they're trans. We also want to be selective about who will speak and the impact that it has on the people included. A reality that often happens in religious communities is that a trans person gets asked to be the one to speak at an event, and they are maybe very early in figuring out who they are, or they aren't someone who is inclined to be a public speaker, but they speak because they've been asked. Some folks, especially if the pastor or the rabbi or the other leader asks them, they feel like they can't say no. So what is the impact on the person who's asked to speak? And what's the impact on the community? I have been to so many trans events and I've witnessed it so many times. And I've heard stories when I give workshops like this from others of people who get asked to lead a discussion or to speak or to be the guest speaker at something just because they're trans. And then it ends up that they themselves end up traumatized by realizing that they're not ready. They're not in an emotional space for it. So I encourage us all to be really conscientious. Another thing in being selective and careful about who we ask to speak, I have been to far too many TDORR events where every single person who talks is white. And I've challenged people on that, and they've often responded with, well, that's who's available. We've got to do better in our communities to get honestly, to get BIPOC voices to pass the mic and not just have white people talking about this issue, because as I said at the beginning, disproportionately so, the people whose lives we are honoring, the people who have died because of anti-trans violence, are trans women of color. So at events, whether it's a church service or a public event or a vigil in the park, having care around who is selected as the guest speaker is just so, so important. And I really encourage us, all of us, as we are working on TDORR, to ignite some kind of call to action. So what does that look like? That looks like right now, finding out what's happening in your area, what organization is helping trans folks. If you live in a place that there aren't a lot of organizations helping trans folks, what's needed? One of the things that is a really great option and is to do a clothing drive. A lot of trans folks need clothes, but also need some help and around business attire, things that they can wear to job interviews, help with that kind of stuff. Can you work with people who already are helping others in the community? Most communities have some kind of organization that helps folks who are learning how to interview for jobs find out how to do that. Could you work with them and get them up to speed on trans issues and say, here's the thing. I mean, there's a huge problem in the trans community around employment because because people are transphobic. And so a call to action could be not the focus of the event, the event maybe it's Trans Day of Remembrance, but could it end with some kind of a call to action? Like, here's how we're going to help the trans community. And I really encourage working with people in the trans community to find out what's needed. If a clothing drive isn't what's needed, then it's not going to help. But there might be some other thing. For example, in my church over the last year, we partnered with a local health organization, Metro Inclusive Health is their name, and we got a CDC grant to do HIV testing. So what we did was, over the last year, we distributed over 500 home HIV test kits. The grant was specifically aimed at anyone was welcome to have a kit. They were all free, but the grant specifically was to help younger people, trans people, and people of color. And so we figured out where there were going to be trans folks, especially trans people of color, and handed out a lot of HIV test kits. So that came out of this organization that does trans healthcare in the community. saying we have this need. They reached out to us, we partnered with them, we applied for this grant. Those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And we did quite a lot at the Trans Day of Remembrance Vigil in that, and handing out the kits. So think about what might be helpful. And also, if you're like, I have no idea what a call to action could possibly be, you could host a listening session, put the word out, say, I want to find out what the community needs, especially if you've got some trans folks in your congregation who you could listen to. And then consider, what programs and activities do you do in your community? What's already there? Where can you access the folks who need that connection? And what, again, I really strongly encourage you to find out, what do people need? Because there could be something that you're not even aware of. You know, maybe it's partnering with a local therapist and giving them the space for free if you have a building for your congregation, a church, synagogue, where a local therapist could have a support group for trans, non-binary, gender questioning people, and launch that as part of the resiliency piece of TDORR. So I'm curious if people want to share, what rites and rituals have you used or do you plan to use in your community around TDORR? Does anyone have any ideas, or even something that you're thinking about that maybe you want to talk through? I don't need to be the only one who's talking, but I will give some examples, and if anyone wants to jump in, you can. Oh yeah, Bernie, go ahead.
Sorry, so I'm not a minister, but worked for many years in, as a liturgical musician, et cetera, et cetera. And this is something I have observed a couple of times. Let me lower my hand. And you mentioned earlier, Jacob, about, really leaning into deep lament, right, which is a part of some of our religious traditions. Something that I've seen done very effectively is, yes, of course, highlighting the names of people who've been murdered, right? That's the center focal point. And I've also seen some really moving elements of a TDORR service that include trans historical figures, some of whom, of course, they were murdered, but others who did not. And I'm thinking back again to the young people situation, to highlight, not to take the emphasis off those people who, were mourning because they were murdered or martyred, but just as a sign of the resilience, right? The historical resilience, which is not the past 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years, but throughout history. So that's just a little something that came to my mind as you were talking.
Yeah, my only thought is to be really careful. I'll again give an example from my community.
Yeah.
We had a famous drag queen, locally famous drag queen, who I just absolutely adored. And she was sort of a matriarch in our church for many, many years. Her name was Tiffany Middlesex. And she died. She didn't die from any kind of violence. She died of natural causes. And it was incredibly painful for our whole church community. And then TDORR rolled around, and people were so surprised that we didn't lift her name up amongst the names. And I had to really do some educating around that. Like, yes, this is what she kind of identified, well, in lots of different ways. I'll say a gender creative person. That's probably the best way to that she would for me to describe how she identified. who died, but she wasn't murdered. It wasn't anything to do with anti-trans violence. But at the same time, this is where I really lean on like Trans Day of Visibility, and lift her up in that time. Now, as long as it's done in a way that's clear, that's like in terms of lifting up other people who have gone before us, who have died, but not from violence. I think as long as it's done in a clear way so that it doesn't get confusing. But yeah, lament is such an important piece of what we do. I mean, another, also in November is All Saints Day, and some for Christian traditions, some traditions do All Saints and All Souls, where we lift up people in our congregations who have died, or people in our lives, not necessarily in the congregation, and spend some time in intentional lament. That's at the beginning of November 1st, or whatever Sunday is closest to then for many congregations. So in some ways it like prepares us that like here we've already had some lamentation, and now a few weeks later, I mean, the inconvenient thing about the timing of TDORR, where that's the convenient piece, the inconvenient is that it almost always falls on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, where people are not in the mood for lamentation. They're often in the mood for the holidays. That kind of, in our cultural context in the US, that often kicks off the holidays. As complicated as that is, that's a conversation for another day, because it's not that Thanksgiving's not problematic. But we can hold complicated things. That's the other piece of doing the work of religious leadership. And then my last question for folks is just to think about what follow-up activities might appeal in your community and context. So as I said, TDORR happens right before Thanksgiving. Then if you're in a Christian church, you're right into Advent from there. And then it's Christmas, and then you've got Epiphany. And that brings us to the middle of January, right? Things are pretty busy from Thanksgiving till the middle of January. So now things settle down a little bit. What could we do to continue thinking about trans awareness, trans inclusion, beyond that week in November? So just kind of think about that. Alvin, I saw Alvin had put in a comment about participants, that his research methodology engages participants in taking photos of belonging on campus. That sounds so great. And he's hoping to work with participants on hosting an event that displays photos in a campus community gallery exhibit, and to do that sometime near TDORR week. That would be awesome. And possibly lifting up trans work, trans photography, trans artwork, not as its own set apart thing, but as part of just, like, let's say in your context, you're doing exhibits with a bunch of different students and just having trans folks mixed in with that. I think that would be really powerful. I think the important thing to consider when talking about TDORR is, how do we not make the trans folks in our community context feel like they only matter in the week around November 20th. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is a resource list that is sort of an ongoing collection of where I drop links when I find good stuff for TDORR and other things. So if you I put my email address in the document. If you have questions, feel free to email me. My email is the letter J, hero, HERO, @clgs.org. But like I said, it's also in this document. For those who can't see the chat, it's a bit.ly link. So it's bit.ly/CLGS TDORR, CLGS TDOR. And that will take you to a Google Doc with a lot of different links to prayers and other organizations, resources. The very first resource that you'll see there is a really cool liturgy that was written by some of the students in the Seminarian leadership cohort, which is my beloved project that I do at CLGS, among other things. And also, I will say, if you know of anyone who identifies as trans, non-binary, or any other kind of creative gender expression who is in any kind of training for religious leadership, I would love for you to put me in touch with them so that I can give them information about the trans leadership cohort. So that's my shameless plug for our program at CLGS. And all right, well, we have come close to the end. Does anyone have any final questions? And then I'm going to hand it over to Bernie for his announcements about other CLGS events. I've never had such a quiet group. Thank you all for being here. All right, Bernie.
More of a chatting group. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I just wanted to let you know about some upcoming programs. And the first is we have a coming out day chapel service here at Pacific School of Religion. And that is it's hybrid. So you can join us live here on campus on Scenic Avenue in Berkeley, or join us online. So go to our website and there's lots of information about that. That's next Tuesday. Wow, coming out day. And then next Thursday, the third workshop in our Queering the 2024 Vote will be with Rachel Ward. Rachel's from the United Church of Christ, their 2024 program that's called Love is Louder, Love Your Neighbor Out Loud campaign. And it talks about ways to engage in the upcoming presidential election and other elections. And then thirdly, we will have our Transgender Day of Remembrance and Resilience service on the 29th of October. And that will be either live or online. Again, so go to our website and you can see all sorts of information about what we're offering.
Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at more of the CLGS programs.
Yes, thank you, Jacob. And thanks everyone for being here.